Elena Brooks had never imagined that an ordinary morning could be torn apart in exactly 30 seconds. Yet that was all it took for the world to know her, as the black woman dragged out of her first-class seat in front of an entire cabin. The shock hit her as abruptly as the slam of a cockpit door, as violently as a bag snapping loose from an overhead bin, and its echo would follow her for months. But in that moment, Elena felt only two things: the searing jolt running down her spine, and the cold, judging eyes that looked at her as if she did not belong. She had arrived at the Atlanta airport when the sky was covered in a thin layer of mist, like paper dressed simply in dark jeans and a soft turtleneck sweater, exactly the kind of outfit she always chose for long business trips. Her hair was tied neatly at the back, her face bare of makeup, her focus entirely on the $200 million deal waiting for her in Seattle. Yet that same simplicity would become the reason a few hours later, uniformed airline employees would look at her as if she were lost. Elena stood at the boarding door, the screen of her phone displaying first-class seat 2A in bright clarity. But Darren Cole, a white male flight attendant with eyes sharp enough to cut through skin, stepped in front of her and asked with a tone that treated her like an imposter, "Ma'am, this lane is for first-class passengers." The sting didn't come from the words, but from the way he emphasized first class, as if it was not meant for someone like her. Eleanor smiled, holding on to the professionalism she had earned over decades in an industry full of hidden biases. "I know. I am in seat 2A. She raised her phone. The green screen glowed unmistakable. But Darren did not look at the information, he looked at her. That look made Elena's skin tighten. "Do you have a printed copy?" he asked, his voice even but slicing. She did not want trouble. She handed him the printed ticket. Darren checked it for so long that a couple behind her began whispering, and a man stepped ahead of her without being questioned at all. Elena felt her heartbeat climbing a tight discomfort, squeezing her chest. By the time Darren finally nodded her through, the humiliation had already lodged itself deep inside her. Still, she walked on. She needed to stay calm. She needed to protect the deal waiting for her. After placing her bag in the overhead compartment and sitting down in seat 2A, she exhaled slowly, swallowing the feeling of being treated as if she did not belong there. She opened her laptop, the blue screen, lighting up the presentation she had spent a year perfecting. But before her breath could steady, Darren appeared again. "I need to see your ticket one more time." Elena sensed the heads in the row ahead turn slightly. A man frowned. A woman clicked her tongue. The entire cabin felt like a glass box where every stare was a blade. She handed him the same documents. Darren glanced briefly, then raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "This seat is reserved for premium passengers." Something inside Elena cracked faintly. "I am a premium passenger," she said, low but steady. "I have been a platinum member for 3 years." Darren ignored her and called the flight supervisor, Richard Hale, a silver-haired man whose eyes were cold steel. He did not check the system, he simply looked at her and declared, "The records show you in seat 17B. A chill shot down Elena's spine. The blatant lie felt like an icy slap across the face. "No," she said, slow and precise. "I gave you my ticket. I have the email. I have the confirmation code. Electronic files can be edited," Richard replied, his voice flat, like he was reading regulations. The murmurs behind her grew louder. A young man scoffed. An older woman shook her head with a familiar expression that said, "Here we go again." Elena felt every vein in her body tighten, and deep down she knew exactly what this was. not the ticket, not the seat. It was her appearance, a black woman dressed simply, occupying a place they did not believe she belonged. Richard leaned in, whispering like a threat, "Either you walk out on your own, or I call security." In that instant, Elena heard her heartbeat pulsing heavily in her ears, slow, weighted, painful. Then a thought flashed. No one would believe her without proof. Her hand trembled as she opened her phone camera. She hit record. When two security officers entered the cabin, the air thickened. One of them spoke in a dull monotone. "Ma'am, you need to leave the aircraft immediately." Her laptop slipped from her hands as she was pulled into the aisle, the dry crack of it hitting the floor, ringing like a gunshot, announcing that the presentation she had prepared, the hundreds of millions of dollars she was on her way to secure, might have just slipped away. But something more important had begun. As she was escorted off the plane, under dozens of watching eyes, Eleanor felt humiliation burn deep into her chest. But beneath it something else ignited. Something stronger than pain, stronger than shame, a fire. Eleanor didn't yet know that only a few minutes later, a young passenger in seat 4C would upload the video online. And her life, along with the entire airline industry, would change forever. Eleanor could not remember how she even walked out of the airport, only the early morning cold clinging to her skin, sinking into a chest that felt squeezed tight, as if by an unseen hand. But the harshest pain was not from the rough pull or the contemptuous stares inside the cabin. It was the feeling of having her dignity stripped away in a place where she had paid in full, complied fully, and tried her best simply to be treated as a human being, nothing more and nothing less. When the taxi door closed, her phone began vibrating non-stop notifications crashing in like a storm, arriving too fast for her to breathe. And the video posted by Olivia Grant, the young woman in seat 4C, had already reached more than 3 million views in just 2 hours, accompanied by tens of thousands of furious comments, eyewitness accounts, and the hashtag #FlyFairNow, spreading like an unplanned call to action that erupted with staggering force. Elena looked at her own reflection in the screen, her breath uneven, and her eyes red not from fear, but because for the first time in her life, the humiliation she felt was no longer hers alone. It had been seen, shared, and spoken aloud by strangers. Yet alongside that wave of support, her corporate inbox began filling with frantic messages from her team, saying the laptop was completely destroyed, the backup file had not synced in time the client was requesting to postpone the meeting, and a wave of dizziness hit her even harder than being dragged from her seat, because she knew a $200 million deal never waited for anyone, not even a victim. But when she stepped into the hotel lobby, barely having time to take off her coat, the phone rang again, this time showing her grandmother's number, and the moment she heard Helen Brooks's deep, slightly raspy voice, something inside Elena broke open. "Are you all right?" her grandmother asked, soft as mist, yet cutting through every layer of defense. Elena swallowed hard and recounted every moment the humiliation, the broken laptop, the way people looked at her like a criminal. Her grandmother listened to all of it in silence, then spoke a sentence that made Eleanor freeze in the crowded hallway. "They picked the wrong woman, Eleanor. You were not born to endure. You were born to change things." The words struck her like a calling, pulling her back into the truth of who she was. The chief executive officer of Nova Shield, the woman who had led her company through market crises, who had broken the barriers investors placed on women of color, who had fought relentlessly to stand where she stood today. But now the fight was no longer about the company or the deal. It was about truth, about dignity, about the right to exist in public spaces without being diminished because of the color of her skin. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and opened her backup laptop. And when the video passed 7 million views, she began writing her open letter to Sky West Pacific Airlines. Not angry, not pleading, simply listing every violation she had experienced, followed by one question. How many others have gone through this without a video to prove it? Her fingers trembled, yet remained steady enough to type the truth she had held inside all morning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Olivia, the woman who filmed the incident, was flooded with messages from reporters, and she explained that she simply thought this cannot happen one more time. The sincerity of that statement brought tears to Elena's eyes, not from weakness, but because for the first time she didn't feel she was fighting alone. But when the letter went live, only 10 minutes later, Sky West Pacific issued a cold statement saying they did not discriminate and that the passenger was removed due to standard verification procedure. Elena read the words and felt as if another blade had been driven into her. No admission of wrongdoing. No goodwill, only empty language, shielding a broken system. And at that moment, Melissa Carter, the investigative journalist Elena had long admired, sent a message saying, "I want to help you. I have received dozens of similar stories over the years. We need to look deeper into the entire system." It was as if every piece began locking into place: the viral video, the public outrage, the calls for change, and the airline's evasive statement, all forming a force, a catalyst, a path Elena knew she had to follow to the end. That night she didn't sleep. She read every comment under the video, including the account of a man forced off a plane because he did not look like a business-class passenger. The story of a mother questioned because there was no way she could have afforded a premium seat. The story of a college student detained in the cabin simply for carrying an old backpack. These accounts lined up like a long indictment, written in pain and tears. Elena began trembling, not from fear, but from the brutal realization that what happened to her was not a mistake. It was a system that had existed quietly for far too long, shielded by vague procedures and meaningless apologies. When her phone buzzed again, she opened the notification the video had officially reached 12 million views in less than a day. She placed her hand over her chest, closed her eyes, and felt a fire rising inside her. The fire of humiliation, the fire of truth, the fire of justice waiting to be named. And Elena knew her fight was only just beginning. Elena had never imagined she would become the center of a nationwide fight for justice. Yet only 2 days after the video spread, a message from Melissa Carter arrived like a blade, tearing open a curtain Elena once believed was untouchable. And soon the two women met in a small conference room at the Nova Shield office, where stark white light spilled over documents, screens, and the evidence Melissa had spent years collecting. Fragmented stories, buried complaints, distorted statistics, all of it suddenly locking together into a portrait so dark it sent a chill down Elena's spine as she looked at it. Melissa laid the boards across the table, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a fury that had been building for far too long. This is not the first time. It is not even the 10th time. These are hundreds of cases. Each testimony was a red pin on a map of the United States. And when Melissa added another mark to the Atlanta area where Eleanor had been forced off her flight, A jolt rushed through Eleanor's body, both painful and awakening. She looked at Melissa, her voice rough with tension. "Are you saying they have been doing this systematically?" Melissa exhaled sharply, her eyes cutting straight through the truth. "It is not a question of maybe. They have been doing it, and they have been doing it for a very long time." The words hurled Elena into a current of truth from which there was no return. They began pulling data, cross-checking employee names, aligning timelines, reviewing passengers removed from cabins without clear justification. Then, as if a shadowed door creaked open, Ethan Carr, a former flight attendant, fired after reporting misconduct reached out to them. Their meeting took place in a small cafe in Seattle, where dim yellow lights and the hum of a coffee grinder masked the weight of every sentence. Ethan, only 29, but with a face aged by the pressure he had endured, leaned forward and lowered his voice as if afraid of being overheard. "I was not just fired. I was threatened. They told me to keep quiet unless I wanted to be blacklisted from the entire aviation industry." Elena clenched her hands beneath the table, but her voice remained low and steady. "What do you know?" Ethan opened his bag and pulled out a carefully wrapped stack of documents, the pages worn, but their contents sharp as blades. "The internal training program. They call it passenger pattern assessment, evaluating passenger patterns. It sounds harmless. But what it really is a classification system based on appearance behavior." And he paused his gaze, locking onto Elena Race. Elena felt her throat tighten. The indifferent words on the page turned into vivid scenes. Darren doubting her the moment he saw her. Richard claiming electronic tickets could be edited. The white passengers behind her who were never checked. None of it was coincidence anymore. It was procedure. Melissa flipped through the documents, her voice cracking with outrage. "They call this behavioral data, but it is nothing more than a list of traits they believe are not suitable for first-class passengers." Elena read the bold line, printed across the middle of the page: indicators, to monitor passengers whose appearance does not correspond to the ticket class purchased. And below it, an even more blatant list: simple clothing passengers, traveling alone, passengers who avoid interaction, women of color in premium cabins. The words ignited a heat in Eleanor that burned so fiercely her palms grew damp. "They were not just suspicious of me," she said, her voice low and cutting like steel. "They were paid to be suspicious of me." Ethan nodded, eyes dropping, as if he were carrying the sins of an entire toxic system. "And when I asked my supervisors why we were doing this, they said it was the company's method of reducing the risk of unusual passenger incidents. They used the word unusual to describe people who look like you." Elena leaned back, her heartbeat pounding like war drums, painful, furious, and forming into a vow. The investigation didn't end there. They filed information requests with the Aviation Safety Bureau and the Department of Transportation, and when the first documents came back, Melissa nearly cried from anger. The files were half redacted, but the remaining pieces revealed a horrifying truth. Passengers of color were removed from flights at 7 times. The rate of white passengers, major airports reported abnormally high numbers of unsuitable passenger reports concentrated on minority groups, and worst of all, internal recommendations for enhanced verification of passengers in high-risk behavioral categories whose every description pointed to people like Elena. When Melissa spread the documents across the table, Elena stood frozen. The entire room seemed to shrink into the breath of 3 people staring at a truth laid bare. This was no longer a single incident. This was a system funded, maintained, concealed and enforced under the name of security. Elena felt her chest ache, not with fear, but with resolve. A resolve that could no longer be extinguished. "If we take this public," Ethan said, his voice trembling with anticipation, "they will do everything to crush us. They will fabricate stories, attack us personally, and rally the entire industry behind them." Melissa looked at Elena, her eyes filled with worry and pride. "But if we do nothing, this will keep happening. To thousands of other Elenas." In that moment, Elena felt her heart grow heavy but fiercely bright. A strange stillness washed through her mind, like the sky just before a storm breaks. She looked at the two people before her, a journalist once threatened for telling the truth, and a former flight attendant who lost his career for speaking up. And Elena understood they were not just collaborators. They were torches lighting the way through the darkness of a system hidden for far too long. "We will continue," Elena said, each word hardening into steel. "We will not back down." Outside the glass wall, the sunset burned the sky into a blazing red-orange, and Elena knew it was not the end of day. It was the signal of a battle about to erupt, a battle against a powerful industry, against decades of entrenched prejudice, and against the silence so many had been forced to endure. But Elena was silent no longer, and the world was about to speak with her. Because her investigation had only just begun, Elena had not anticipated the destructive force of challenging an entire system. Yet only 3 days after her team released their first findings, the sky over Nova Shield darkened into the color of a coming storm. It was not a storm born of nature, but one unleashed by an industry armed with massive public relations budgets, formidable legal teams, and a willingness to crush anyone who dared speak the truth. One morning, as Eleanor walked into the office, her employees' eyes carried the same anxious shade, and the computer screens throughout the floor displayed the headlines targeting her chief executive officer. "Elena Brooks exaggerates incident to gain public attention. Internal source reveals Nova Shield faces severe management crisis. Is this a failed public relations strategy?" Those headlines were like poisoned arrows aimed straight at the honor and credibility Elena had spent half her life building. She had not even drawn a full breath when Gina, her executive assistant, rushed over, face pale. "We just lost 2 more major clients. They said they will suspend collaboration until the media stabilizes." Elena's heart dipped, but she could not allow weakness to show. Her phone vibrated non-stop, reporters digging into her private life, anonymous accounts sending threats and messages from the legal team advising her to increase personal security. Melissa walked into the conference room, her expression firm. "They are creating smoke screens. They cannot destroy the evidence, so they are trying to destroy you." Then the door burst open again, Trevor Nova Shield's chief technology officer, breathless. "Elena, our stock just dropped 14%. It felt as if someone had drained all the air from the room. Elena looked at the electronic board on the wall, the red numbers blinking violently, like flames devouring the future of her company. She knew what she needed to say, but her throat tightened for a moment. Finally, she drew in a deep breath. "We will not retreat. Not today, not ever." But even as she spoke, she saw the fear spreading across her employees' faces, because they were not only fighting for justice, they were fighting for their jobs. In the days that followed, the media assault became sharper, more calculated. An anonymous article claimed Elena had falsified early business filings. A cheap tabloid blog implied she had a personality issue that caused staff to resign in waves, and a swarm of fake accounts spread rumors that Melissa had been paid to twist the truth. There was no real evidence, but enough to plant doubt in the minds of those who didn't know better. Elena felt as if she had been placed on a public operating table. Yet worse than the outside attack was the battle emerging inside her own company. The board meeting took place in a glass room on the 14th floor. The stillness inside made clear that decisions had already been whispered behind her back. Robert Kane, a long-standing board member, leaned forward, his tone calm but carrying the scent of pressure. Elena, the company is bleeding. 3 clients have suspended partnerships. 2 investors are re-evaluating their agreements. We cannot take any more damage. You should accept the settlement from Sky West Pacific. Eleanor glanced down at the stack of documents in front of her, a compensation offer of enormous value, but tied to a thick non-disclosure agreement that would silence her from ever speaking publicly about the incident. Signing it would end everything instantly. The company would be safe, but the truth would drown. Melissa stood at the back of the room, silent yet fierce. Trevor's expression held worry and pride, as if he believed she would choose what was right, even if it cost everything. Elena felt 2 invisible hands pulling her in opposite directions, one toward her responsibility to the company, her employees, the people who depended on her, and the other toward the truth that hundreds, even thousands, had suffered before her. Then her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. You were born to change things. Elena lifted her head, her gaze sharpened as if tempered by flame. No. A single word, but its echo seemed to shake the room. I will not sign any agreement that silences me. My silence will allow thousands of others to continue being mistreated. And Nova Shield wasn't built on fear. A long, tense stillness followed so heavy it froze every breath in the room. Robert tightened his grip on his glasses. Other members whispered among themselves. The tension felt like the moment before a tidal wave crashes. Then the door opened, and a breathless assistant stepped inside. Jonathan Reed is here. He wants to join the meeting immediately. The entire room seemed to stop. Jonathan Reed, tech billionaire, founder of Horizon Data Systems, Nova Shield's largest commercial partner, and the one person with the power to save the company with a single signature. He entered with neatly combed silver hair and the calm expression of someone who had witnessed countless power struggles. No one understood why he appeared at that exact moment, but when he placed a stack of documents on the table, Elena sensed that the storm outside was about to shift direction. Jonathan scanned the room, his voice steady. I have reviewed all the evidence. I believe Elena. And Horizon will invest in Nova Shield with only one condition, that Elena continues this fight. Mouths fell open. Disbelief flickered across faces. And Elena, who had spent a week being shredded by the media, suddenly felt the ground beneath her steady again. Not because of the money, not because of rescue, but because for the first time since the incident, someone powerful stood beside her, not to stop her from fighting, but to push her forward. In that moment, Elena understood that the battle was no longer hers alone. It had become the battle of everyone who believed justice could not be built on silence. The media attacks had not defeated her. They had only prepared her for a far greater confrontation waiting ahead. Elena stepped out of the meeting room with Jonathan Reed, feeling as if she had just walked through an earthquake, and though the ground had stopped shaking, she knew a far greater seismic wave was waiting ahead. The support of a billionaire could keep Nova Shield standing, but to dismantle a racial profiling system built over decades, she needed something money could not buy the law, political power, and mechanisms strong enough to force an entire industry to change. That was why, 3 days later, Elena found herself in the Washington, D.C. office of Senator Caroline Hughes, a 61-year-old woman with neatly tied gray hair and eyes that were both sharp and compassionate, a woman who had spent half her life fighting for civil rights in transportation. Caroline studied Eleanor for a long moment before speaking. "I watched your video. I read the documents Melissa sent. And I need to tell you this. You are not just the victim of an incident. You are the victim of a structure." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of every word. Caroline tapped the stack of files on her desk. "I have been trying to push a passenger rights bill that has been delayed 3 times due to airline pressure. But your case might be the spark we have been waiting for." For the first time, Elena understood that her story was not only changing her life, it could change an entire country. The media storm had driven public outrage, but to turn that outrage into action, they needed people in Congress willing to stand up. When Caroline slid the draft of the Air Passenger Equality Act toward Elena, her hands trembled slightly. The provisions addressed transparency requirements, data reporting, independent oversight, fair dispute procedures, and above all, an absolute ban on any form of passenger assessment based on personal characteristics unrelated to security. As Elena read, she felt as if someone had handed her a map of the road she was destined to walk. But Caroline warned her, the airlines will fight fiercely. They will pour tens of millions into lobbying. They will threaten senators from states with major airports, and they will try to break you. Elena met her gaze with steady determination. They already tried, but I am still here. From that moment, Elena entered an entirely new world, a world of senators, political advisors, legal experts, lobbyists, and civil rights organizations. Every meeting was a battlefield, every briefing note a bullet, every phone call a tug-of-war between ethics and power. They created lists of senators. They could persuade senators who might shift under pressure and senators who would oppose the bill at any cost. Elena flew from state to state meeting constituents, speaking in auditoriums, answering questions on national television, and sharing the humiliation she had endured, but never with resentment. Her voice was always calm, clear, and weighty, as if each sentence carved itself into the minds of those listening. I am not asking for privilege. I am asking for equal treatment. And then something extraordinary happened. People began telling their stories. An Asian American businessman questioned without cause. A Latino mother forced off a plane because she did not look like someone who could afford a business-class ticket. A black veteran suspected even while wearing his uniform. All these stories were added to FlyFair, the platform Elena created, and within 2 weeks, they collected more than 8,000 testimonies. This number sent shockwaves through the media. Lawmakers who once ignored her began paying attention. Senators who had been opposed began hesitating. And then the most important day arrived, the Senate Transportation Committee hearing on the bill. Elena walked into the grand room with dozens of cameras, hundreds of reporters, and across from her sat representatives from major airlines, including Sky West Pacific's Chief Executive Officer, Michael Dorsey, the man who had quietly orchestrated the smear campaign against her. Elena sat down, her hand resting on the folder containing the truth she had spent months preparing. When the microphone switched on, she told her story with no shaking, no anger, no bitterness, only truth, a truth powerful enough to silence the entire room. When she presented the data, passengers of color removed from flights at 7 times the rate of white passengers, the unusual clustering of unsuitable passenger notes, the so-called enhanced verification procedures disproportionately targeting women of color. Some senators lowered their heads. Some scribbled notes urgently, and some stared at the airline executives as if their eyes could pierce through their excuses. Michael Dorsey attempted to push back, but his phrases like standard procedures, unfortunate misunderstandings, and security assurance clanged against the silence, like metal striking stone, cold, hollow, and afraid. When a senator asked him directly, "Can you explain why 87% of passengers removed from flights last year belonged to minority groups?" Michael froze. That was the moment every mask fell. The hearing ended with public opinion exploding, and for the first time, the bill's approval rating surpassed 60%. But Eleanor knew this was not victory. The vote was still ahead, and the airline industry would not surrender easily. As she predicted, their lobbying intensified beyond anything she had seen. They threatened to shut down maintenance hubs in key states. They promised new routes if senators voted against the bill. They released fabricated economic reports warning of billions in damages. These tactics were not new, but they were dangerous. One evening, Elena sat alone in her hotel room, yellow lamplight casting exhaustion across her face. For the first time, she felt fear tighten around her ribcage. What if they won? She had sacrificed her reputation, her time, her health, even her personal safety. She had thrown her company into a storm, but when she opened her phone, she saw a message from a 17-year-old girl. "Thank you. Because of you, I am no longer afraid to fly." Elena broke down in tears, not out of weakness, but because the truth had reached someone. It had mattered to someone. And she knew she could not back down. That resolve would carry her into the greatest battle of her life, the battle on the Senate floor, the battle that would determine the future of millions of passengers, the battle Elena was ready to fight to the very last moment. Elena had never lived through a night as long as this one, a night stretched so thin it felt ready to tear as she, Caroline Hughes, and the strategy team raced against the clock to save the remaining undecided votes hanging between two extremes. The sky over Washington, D.C. held no stars that night, only a weary, heavy shade of deep blue pressing down on towering government buildings, where hundreds of decisions were made every day, yet rarely did any decision carry the emotional weight of this bill. Elena stepped onto the balcony outside Senator Hughes's office to breathe, but even the air felt dense with warning. If the bill fails, every piece of evidence, every effort, every hope will fall into the abyss. Inside, the meeting continued like a silent game of Go between invisible forces. On the data board, each senator's name was marked in green, red, or yellow. Green for supporters, red for opponents, yellow for the undecided. And it was those yellow squares that had tormented Eleanor for days. Senator Davis, who worried about high implementation costs, Senator Wong, who feared data privacy violations, and above all, Senator Raj Patel, who was being pulled toward the airline lobby by promises of investment into the maintenance center in his home state. Elena stared at the three yellow squares as though they were three doors to the future, one opening into light, two opening into darkness. "We must persuade them before morning," Caroline said, her voice stretched taut like a string pulled to its breaking point. Exhaustion clung to her eyes, yet her resolve never wavered. "If not, the bill will die on the Senate floor." Elena inhaled deeply. Then they launched into a desperate but calculated marathon. First was Davis. Elena opened the cost report, the one Trevor and the tech team had spent weeks preparing. If implemented properly, Elena said through a phone call that lasted nearly an hour, the actual cost will be lower than the amount airlines spend settling lawsuits every year. Prevention is cheaper than repair. Davis fell silent for a long time. Then he said, "Send me the full analysis. I will review it." The first hint of movement, they immediately moved on to Wong. Wong's concern was not money, but ethics. "I do not want this law becoming an excuse to collect data on innocent passengers," she said, her voice sharp enough that Elena knew a single wrong word could end this. Elena explained calmly, "We propose a reporting system using aggregated data, only no personal information. It is transparent, not invasive." Trevor sent Wong a simulation directly, and only 10 minutes later, her reply arrived. "I will reconsider my position." One yellow square shifted to pale green in Elena's mind, though not officially. But the hardest challenge remained Raj Patel. Caroline exhaled heavily at his name. Patel is a good man, but he is trapped between justice and the economic interests of his state. Elena thought for a long moment, then said, "Let me call him." The call took place at 1 hour and 6 minutes after midnight. Raj Patel answered. After 3 rings, his voice weighted down. "I know why you are calling," he said. "But I cannot let hundreds of local workers lose their jobs if Sky West pulls the maintenance center from my state." Elena leaned against the table, feeling the world narrow into each word she spoke. "Senator," she said slowly, "they will not leave. Moving a maintenance center costs billions of dollars and requires at least 3 years of federal approval. They are using threats to force your vote." There was a long silence. Then he asked, "Are you certain?" Certain, Eleanor replied. "If they relocate just to avoid fair treatment of passengers, it would become an economic scandal unlike anything seen before. They will not risk it." The call ended without a promise, but Elena knew her words had landed exactly where they needed to. Afterward, she and Melissa returned to the office, where Caroline and the advisors were still awake, their eyes red but their minds sharp. They reviewed the list of 52 potential supporting votes. They prepared final briefing notes. They drafted clarifications for each provision. And then, when the clock struck 4 in the morning, Caroline gently placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Get some sleep. If you collapse when we need you, everything will fall apart." Elena wanted to protest, but her eyelids were already heavy as stone. She fell asleep on a conference room chair, her short, fractured dreams, filled with disjointed images, being dragged off the plane. The look on Olivia Grant's face as she recorded the video, Ethan Carr whispering, "I was forced into silence," the stern expression of Michael Dorsey, and her grandmother's voice. "You were born to change things." When Elena opened her eyes again, the sky outside was a pale grey, the dawn breathing faintly like a day waiting to rewrite history. Together they entered the Capitol building, where the wide marble halls echoed with the footsteps of hundreds of people. Walking through the crowd, Elena felt as though she were stepping into the center of a storm. When she took her seat in the guest section, Caroline leaned close and whispered, "We have Wong. Davis is leaning our way. Patel." She did not finish. Elena swallowed hard, her hands tightening. One lost vote would shatter everything. When the Senate chair began calling names for the final vote, Elena's heart pounded like a war drum. Davis, eh? Elena's chest loosened slightly. Wong, I. A tear pushed up behind her eyes, but she held it back. Then, Patel. The entire chamber held its breath. Elena could hear the sound of a pin drop inside that silence. And at last, from his steady voice, came the answer. Aye. Eleanor closed her eyes, hand pressed over her heart, feeling the entire world exhale with her. When the chair announced the bill passes with 52 votes in favor, Eleanor wanted to cry, to laugh, to collapse from relief. But more than anything, she knew this today did not just restore the dignity of one person, it restored the right to be respected for millions of passengers across the skies of America. And from that moment, Elena realized she was no longer merely a victim. She had become a voice, a symbol, a force behind a revolution within the aviation industry. But the fight was not over. The hardest part was about to begin. Because once a law is passed, those who are threatened by it will do everything possible to evade it. Elena was preparing to enter a new battle, a battle to force the most powerful players to comply with justice. But this time, she was no longer alone. Elena had thought that after the bill passed, she would have a few days to breathe, to savor the victory that she, Melissa Trevor, and countless supporters had poured their hearts and souls into. But the reality was far more intense than she had imagined. That victory was like a whirlwind, triggering a cascade of collapse within the leadership of Sky West Pacific, the airline that had thrown her off the plane and then shattered her reputation through a smear campaign. Only 2 days after the Senate approved the bill, the news spread across every headline. Sky West Pacific stock plummeted 22%. Partner corporations withdrew from sponsorship agreements, and thousands flooded letters demanding CEO Michael Dorsey's resignation. In an emergency boardroom at Sky West Pacific headquarters, major shareholders crowded around the long walnut table, their faces tense, eyes cold, like referees moments before a verdict. "We are bleeding," one investor said, his voice sharp as a blade. "And the reason is this leadership team." Another slammed his hand on the table. "The airline is seen as a national symbol of discrimination." The stock drop is not trivial. "How long do you plan to watch?" Michael Dorsey tried to maintain composure, but sweat on his temples betrayed his fear. "We just need to adjust the messaging." Before he could finish, he was cut off sharply. "It's not messaging. It's the company culture. Everyone knows whose culture this is." And within a single internal vote, Michael Dorsey's 30-year career ended. He was terminated that very day, escorted out of the building as a symbol of failure. But the surprise came in the form of his replacement, Laura Mitchell, former Chief Operating Officer, who had left the airline 3 years earlier in protest of internal policies she considered ethically dangerous. Laura appeared before the press with elegant curly hair, a powerful black suit, her voice calm yet commanding. "I am returning not to patch an old system, but to build a new one." That statement became the headline across all news outlets the following day. That same afternoon, while Eleanor was at the Nova Shield office, immersed in congratulatory emails mixed with threats, her phone rang. A familiar voice said, "Eleanor Brooks, this is Laura Mitchell. We need to meet." Eleanor jumped, as if a live wire had shocked her suspicion. Alertness and curiosity intertwining until her entire body was tense. The airline that had destroyed her flight, her reputation, now wanted to meet, to apologize, to negotiate, or to extinguish the fire she had just ignited. But when the meeting took place in the Department of Transportation conference room, Eleanor realized Laura had not come to ask for forgiveness. She had come to start a new era. Laura opened her laptop and presented a plan Elena had not anticipated to completely rebuild the passenger assessment process, retrain flight attendants, implement real-time bias monitoring technology, and create a dialogue procedure between passengers and staff before any removal decisions were made. I want Sky West Pacific not only to comply with the law, Laura said firmly, but to lead in establishing a new standard. Elena looked at her intently. And you want me to help with that? No, Laura replied, a thin smile curling her lips. I want you to lead it. The words struck Elena like lightning. Me. You understand the system from both sides, the victim and the tech expert. You have seen the darkness, and you know where the light must begin. Elena felt her heart race. A part of her wanted to refuse immediately, work with the airline that had humiliated her. But another part, the part that had always believed systemic change mattered more than personal revenge, stirred quietly. Melissa spoke, her voice cold. We must ensure every reform is publicly documented, with no cover-ups. Laura nodded, fully transparent. I will sign a pledge. Trevor leaned over and whispered to Elena. If they truly want change, no one is better suited to lead it than you. Elena looked at each face in the room, feeling a strange power swirling within her, not anger, not fear, but the sense of standing before a great open door, leading to a path where her suffering could be transformed into industry change. Finally, she said, I agree. But I am setting conditions. Laura smiled. Go ahead. First, all reform processes must be published in stages. Agreed. Second, any employee who violates policy will not only face internal consequences, but the reports will be sent to aviation oversight authorities. Agreed. Third, I am not an employee of Sky West Pacific. I am independent. I retain the right to speak out. Laura did not hesitate. Agreed. Elena looked Laura directly in the eyes. And fourth, I want it all to start with a public apology. For the first time in the meeting, Laura paused for a few seconds, then nodded firmly. You will have it. When the meeting ended, Elena walked down the long hallway of the Department of Transportation, where light poured through massive glass panels as if illuminating the path she was about to take. She slowed, placing a hand on the railing, closing her eyes. She could step away from this story. She could let it be just one victory and end there. But she chose to continue. Not for fame, not for the company, but for the millions of passengers out there carrying the same fear of humiliation she once felt who had never had a voice. Elena knew the road ahead would be bitter and full of conflict, for reform is never a journey paved with roses. But she also knew one thing to change an entire airline industry. Someone must have the courage to fly into the first turbulence. And that someone is her. Elena woke in a small hotel room in Washington, D.C., the dawn light streaming through the curtains like a thin veil barely softening the pressure that hung over the city. Yet she knew that light did nothing to ease the weight she felt. Her phone buzzed continuously with updates from the legal team, from Melissa, from Trevor, and from Senator Caroline Hughes, reporting on the progress of lobbying each senator, every email, every call categorized by importance and potential impact. Elena rolled her eyes at the color-coded map on her screen, green for supporters, red for opponents, yellow for undecided. The more she looked, the clearer the picture became. Those yellow squares, particularly Senator Raj Patel's, would determine the fate of the entire bill. Elena took a deep breath, feeling her heartbeat quicken with each pulse. And when her phone rang again, she saw Patel's name, his voice deep and weighted. Are you certain the system you propose will not harm the maintenance facilities in my state? Elena responded, immediately calm, but precise. Detailing the analysis, Trevor and the technical team had prepared long-term benefits, far outweighing short-term costs, improvements in service quality, and most importantly, economic gains for his state while preserving employee rights, preventing layoffs and avoiding excessive disruption. Patel was silent for a moment, each second heavy like tons of stone. Then he said, "I will vote in favor." Elena's heart felt like it might burst, but she could not show it. She had to stay composed to continue persuading the remaining undecided senators. Next was Senator Wong, concerned with data privacy and passenger information security. Elena opened her presentation displaying encryption mechanisms, aggregate data classification, and the secure monitoring system the team had programmed, demonstrating that all collected data remained anonymous, without passenger identification, and fully traceable by oversight authorities. Wong tilted her head, still stern, yet Elena could sense a subtle shift in her position. She persuaded with numbers, logic programming, and tireless persistence, the power of someone standing at the intersection of ethics and authority. And finally, Wong agreed to support the bill. Elena exhaled with relief, but Davis remained hesitant about implementation costs and economic impact. She sent him the detailed analysis, comparing the cost of implementing the bill to the money airlines had spent on litigation settlements and crisis PR over the past 5 years. The figures were vivid, clear, and undeniable. Davis was silent, reading each line, and Elena sensed the shift in his thinking. And only after a final afternoon call did the last 3 yellow squares on the map turn fully green. Finally, the day of the vote arrived. Elena sat in the gallery of the Senate, her eyes sweeping across every attendee, every camera, every reporter, every security officer, feeling the weight of every second, every breath. When the Senate president began calling names for each vote, her heart pounded as if it would explode. Davis A. Elena's chest eased slightly. Wong I. She held back a tear. And then Patel. The room fell silent. Elena could hear the pin drop, and finally from his steady voice came the answer, I. Elena closed her eyes, hand over her heart, feeling as if the entire world exhaled with her. When the chair announced, the Air Passenger Equality Act passes with 52 votes in favor, 48 against, Elena wanted to cry, to laugh, to collapse from relief. But above all, she knew this today had not only restored the dignity of one person, it had restored the right to be respected for millions of passengers across the skies of America. And from that moment, Elena realized she was no longer merely a victim. She had become a voice, a symbol, a driving force behind a revolution in the airline industry. Yet the fight was not over. The hardest part was yet to come. Because once a law is passed, those affected by it will do everything possible to evade it. Elena was preparing to enter a new battle, a battle to force the most powerful players to comply with justice. But this time, she was no longer alone. 1 year after the shock of being stripped from first class, Elena Brooks boarded a flight from Atlanta to Seattle, the very route where she had been pulled from her seat. But this time, everything was completely different. She wore a crisp, dark blue suit, her hair tied neatly, her gaze confident, yet she maintained the necessary simplicity. As she placed her Hermes bag in the overhead compartment, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile and a bow welcome aboard Mrs. Brooks. We have been instructed on the new procedures, and all passengers will be treated fairly. Elena smiled, feeling as if the nightmare from the previous year had dissolved into a thin, dissipating mist. Even as she settled into seat 2A, She noticed that every step and procedure was standardized, transparent ticket verification information confirmed according to the SkyShield protocol, every passenger treated under the same standards, regardless of race, gender, or attire. Her eyes scanned the passengers around her, no longer tense or fearful of suspicion or unfair treatment. Elena observed flight attendant Jasmine Powell, who had completed the first training under the Phoenix Protocol, moving through the cabin, interacting with passengers politely and respectfully, checking every action according to the new standard. Her smile was natural, no longer showing the caution or tension of those who had witnessed Elena's humiliation the year before. As Elena took out her tablet to review market data for the upcoming meeting, a middle-aged man looked at her with surprise and a hint of respect, no longer dismissive or suspicious. A younger passenger glanced at her screen, furrowed his brow, then shook his head, realizing that passengers like Elena were now protected by the new system. In that moment, Elena recognized the power of what she and her team had created, not just legislation, not just a bill, but a system operating in reality where every passenger had the right to be respected. She sat down, feeling a rare sense of peace, yet deep inside, a quiet excitement burned. Millions of passengers would no longer endure what she had suffered. As the pilot announced takeoff, Elena looked out the window, watching Atlanta gradually disappear beneath the clouds, feeling as if she were flying over a path of historical progress. She thought of Olivia Grant, who had filmed the video last year and was now coordinator of the Equitable Skies Fund that Elena had established to continue monitoring and supporting passengers facing discrimination. Looking around the cabin, Elena saw passengers smiling lightly at the flight attendants, interacting normally, no longer hesitant or tense. Eyes that had once been suspicious had become trusting, and she knew that her efforts had set the standard. She recalled the despair she felt when her laptop was broken, when the hundreds of millions of dollars deal seemed doomed, when the attendants and management had looked at her with contempt. And now all those feelings had transformed into living proof change could happen if one person dared to stand up, if a single individual refused to remain silent. Elena looked down at FlyFair on her device, seeing thousands of new reports from passengers across the United States. Words of thanks, stories of previously overlooked experiences, evidence of service improvements. She smiled, her eyes shining with pride, yet tempered by humility, knowing the work was not finished. The system may have changed in part, but there were still many steps needed to ensure all airlines complied and every passenger was respected. As the plane stabilized at cruising altitude, Elena closed her eyes, took a deep breath. Feeling each inhale, each vibration of the cabin, realizing that her greatest joy was not the passing of the bill or Sky West Pacific changing its CEO, but that each passenger, each individual, even those she had never met, could now board a plane without fear, without contempt, and be protected by a system she had poured her soul into creating. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving breakfast, Elena observed every action, every greeting, every glance, each imbued with transparency and respect. She realized that for the first time since she had stepped into the cabin last year, she no longer felt isolated or excluded, but part of a fair space where every passenger was treated equally. She quietly observed the entire cabin, from young passengers to the elderly, to busy business travelers, all following the same procedures, the same standards, and Elena knew that the effort she had invested every hour, every meeting, every email, every urgent call over the past year had transformed the skies into a safer place. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the morning light streamed through the windows, reflecting off passengers' faces, smiling naturally, and Elena felt a deep joy completely different from temporary happiness or personal satisfaction. She knew the next steps on the ground would take her into meetings and negotiations, but this time without fear, without humiliation, only with the peace and power of true change. As she stepped off the plane, Elena felt as though she were emerging from the shadows of injustice into a world where justice, transparency, and respect had become reality, where she was no longer a victim, but a leader, a change maker, and a symbol for millions of passengers across the United States. 1 year after losing her first-class privileges, Elena Brooks stepped onto a flight from Atlanta to Seattle, the very route where she had once been pulled from her seat. But this time, everything was completely different. She wore a neatly tailored dark blue suit, her hair tied back, her gaze confident, yet she maintained the necessary simplicity. As she placed her Hermes bag into the overhead compartment, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile and a bow. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Brooks. We have been instructed on the new procedures, and all passengers will be treated fairly." Elena smiled, feeling as if the nightmare from the previous year had dissolved into a thin, dissipating mist. Even as she settled into seat 2A, she noticed that every step and procedure was standardized, transparent ticket verification information confirmed through the SkyShield system, all passengers treated under the same standards with no distinction based on race, gender, or attire. Her eyes scanned the cabin, seeing passengers now relaxed, conversing, smiling, no longer tense or fearful of being singled out or treated unfairly. She observed flight attendant Jasmine Powell, who had completed her first training under the Phoenix Protocol, moving through the cabin, interacting with passengers politely and respectfully, while checking all actions according to the new standard. Her smile was natural, no longer showing hesitation or tension, as it had during the incident the year before. As Eleanor took out her tablet to review market data for the upcoming meeting, a middle-aged passenger looked at her with surprise and respect, no longer dismissive or suspicious. A younger passenger glanced at her screen, furrowed his brow, then shook his head, realizing that passengers like Eleanor were now protected by the new system. In that moment, Eleanor recognized the power of what she and her team had created, not merely a law, not merely a bill, but a functioning system where every passenger had the right to be respected. She sat back, feeling a rare sense of peace, yet deep inside, a quiet excitement burned. Millions of passengers would no longer endure what she had suffered. As the pilot announced takeoff, Elena looked out the window, watching Atlanta gradually disappear beneath the clouds, feeling as if she were flying over a path of historical progress. She thought of Olivia Grant, who had filmed the video last year, and now served as coordinator of the Equitable Skies Fund that Elena had established to continue monitoring and supporting passengers facing discrimination. Glancing around the cabin, Elena saw passengers smiling lightly at the attendants, interacting normally, free from hesitation or anxiety. Eyes that had once been suspicious were now filled with trust, and she knew her efforts had set a standard. She recalled the despair of her broken laptop, the seemingly failed hundreds of millions of dollars deal, the contemptuous glances from attendants and management. And now all those feelings had transformed into living proof. Change could happen if one person dared to stand up, if an individual refused to remain silent. Elena looked at FlyFare on her device, seeing thousands of new reports from passengers across the United States, Words of thanks, stories of experiences once overlooked, evidence of improved service. She smiled, her eyes shining with pride, tempered by humility, knowing the work was far from over. The system may have changed in part, but many steps remained to ensure all airlines complied and every passenger was respected. As the plane stabilized at cruising altitude, Elena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, feeling each inhale, each vibration of the cabin, realizing that her greatest joy was not in the passage of the bill or the change of SkyWest Pacific's CEA, but that each passenger, each individual, even those she had never met, could now board a plane without fear, without contempt, and be protected by a system she had poured her heart and soul into creating. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin serving breakfast, Elena observed every action, every greeting, every glance, each filled with transparency and respect. She realized that for the first time since stepping into the cabin last year, she no longer felt isolated or excluded, but part of a fair space where every passenger was treated equally. She quietly observed the entire cabin, from young passengers to the elderly to busy business travelers, all following the same procedures, the same standards, and Elena knew that the effort she had invested every hour, every meeting, every email, every urgent call over the past year had transformed the skies into a safer place. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, morning light streamed through the windows, reflecting off the passengers' faces, smiling naturally, and Elena felt a deep, authentic joy, completely unlike temporary satisfaction or personal triumph. She knew that the next steps on the ground would involve meetings and negotiations, but this time without fear, without humiliation, only with the peace and power of true change. As she stepped off the plane, Elena felt as though she were emerging from the shadows of injustice into a world where fairness, transparency, and respect had become reality, where she was no longer a victim, but a leader, a change maker, and a symbol for millions of passengers across the United States. From the perspective of an expert in leadership and organizational culture, Elena Brooks's journey reveals a profound truth. Lasting change does not come from power or money, but begins when an individual dares to stand tall, confront injustice, and transform humiliation into strategic action to create a fairer system. This story reminds us that every courageous decision, every steadfast action can generate ripple effects beyond imagination, impacting millions of people and transforming an entire industry. If Elena's story inspires you, hit like to spread the message of justice and courage, and subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful journeys. Leave a comment with the phrase "Stand Tall" as a reminder that sometimes, when just one person rises, the whole world can follow.